Dateline, Union Vedette, March 8th, 1864, quote, referring to our strictures yesterday on the management of the penitentiary, we are informed that the institution is in a sad state of repair. The friends of the warden allege that in its present dilapidated condition, it is almost impossible to keep secure the prisoners committed to his charge. If this be true, and to a certain extent we have no doubt it is, there has been great negligence on the part of somebody. We recollect that at the last session of the legislature, it was apparently accidentally discovered that there is in the public treasury in Washington a large sum of money, $8,000, deposited to the credit of the Penitentiary of Utah. We understand that in pursuant of a resolution of the legislature, necessary steps have been taken to secure this fund and that the money will soon be here. We trust that it will be judiciously and promptly applied. End quote. I'm Wendy. This is Demolish Salt Lake and the story of the Utah Territorial Penitentiary, Part 1. Hello and welcome to episode 6. It's a bit of a rainy and gloomy day here today, so it's a great day to talk about a prison. I mentioned in the last episode that prisons are one of my top 3 favorite historical buildings, along with hospitals and schools. I might be a bit obsessed with this particular prison though, but I mean, its history is really fascinating. It has gone by many names: the Utah Territorial Penitentiary, the Utah Penitentiary, the Utah State Penitentiary, and to the locals, the Sugar House Prison. It was also known as the United States Penitentiary when the U.S. Marshals controlled it in the late 1800s. Its history is very long and, as you would expect, very sordid. Are we ready? Okay, let's dive in. Let me set the stage by talking about government in the early years of Salt Lake City. As you can imagine, with the city being settled by religious leaders, there was a total melding of church and state. Government officials consisted of members of the LDS Church, and aside from their church duties, they also served as court of justices. There was not a jail at the time. Instead, offenders faced other types of punishments. One was public whippings, and a whipping post was set up for this purpose. Other methods were making a full confession, promising to do better, paying a fine, or being ostracized and kicked right out of the city. Remember back to the episode about the John B. Kelly House, when I talked about the city being divided into 19 separate LDS wards? This also moved the control of punishment from city officials to the bishops that presided over each ward. This worked because most of the population were members of the church, so there was really no need for civil law when church law did the trick. This all worked fine until it didn't, and that started to happen in about 1849 with the movement of people looking to strike it rich in the gold fields of California. Many of those people ended up staying in Salt Lake, which meant an influx of non-Mormons, which meant a change in how leaders dealt with lawbreakers. In September of 1850, the Utah Territory was created. It would be another year before the territorial government was put into place. A criminal code was created in 1851. Those found guilty faced a variety of punishments depending on their crime. They could be sentenced to hard labor with a ball and chain around their ankle. One could redeem themselves by paying a fine, or a fine could be paid by another person, and prisoners then served out their sentence under the terms of the person who purchased them. Yes, you could purchase your very own prisoner and have them work off the purchase however you deemed appropriate. Now, what could go wrong with that? As for those convicted and sentenced to death, the Legislative Assembly passed an act that read, quote, "When any person shall be convicted of any crime, the punishment of which is death according to the provisions of the act, and sentenced to die, said person shall suffer death by being shot, hung, or beheaded, as the court may direct, or the person so condemned shall have his option as to the manner of his execution." End quote. I'll talk more about executions in part 2. When Congress approved the organization of the Utah Territory, it also approved money for a territorial prison, but it wasn't until 1853 that the money actually showed up to build the prison. Congress approved a whopping $20,000 for the entire cost of land and construction. The task of finding a site fell to Mr. A.W. Babbitt, Secretary of the Treasury. After quite a search, he located a 10-acre site 5 miles outside of the city limits. Today, this is part of Sugar House Park. I know the park is really big, so to give you context on where the prison was located, it's at parallel to 2100 South, between 1400 East and 1500 East. For those of you who walk the roads around the park or play on its hills or in the parks, all of that was prison grounds. Back in the day, the topography of the park was much different. It was flat. There were no hills. Those hills are actually man-made from when the park was established. So for Babbitt, working with $20,000 to build a prison was not an easy task. It took some rounds of proposals for one to finally be accepted. The architecture firm of Little and Young was contracted to build the penitentiary. A warden's house, a prison house, workshop, and outer court were all constructed. The walls of the outer court were 12 feet high and 4 feet thick and made of adobe. Another wall made of rock enclosed 7 acres of the entire site. 4 watchtowers were built on the 4 corners of this wall, and a walkway made of lumber was built on top of the wall for guards to walk the perimeter of the prison yard. There were 16 cells built underground in the prison house. Prison cells are inherently undesirable, but I can imagine that these cells were most undesirable. The only comfortable living quarters on the entire site was the warden's house. In 1857, the workshop burned down, and the next year, part of the prison house blew over during a storm. By 1860, the prison was in pretty bad shape, and it wouldn't be for another couple of years before a small amount of money was given to repair the prison. Into the 1870s, the prison continued to degrade. There wasn't even enough money to pay the night guards, which meant prisoners easily escaped. I mean, very easily escaped. Almost like walked out the front door escaped. In 1871, the penitentiary was turned over to the United States Marshals and became known as the United States Penitentiary. It would keep this name until it was given back to the state in the late 1800s. By 1883, the prison was still in pretty bad shape, but had undergone some changes over the years. The outer wall was now 19 feet tall. There were many additional buildings. One was made of logs that was used for a bathroom, wash house, and dining and meeting hall. 2 others were cell houses made of adobe and stone. These houses consisted of 1 large room with bunk beds stacked 3 high along the walls. 2 iron cage enclosures called the sweat box, where unruly prisoners were sent, were located in the prison yard. There was also a hospital, solitary confinement, and insane asylum cages. If you were wondering about female prisoners, they were kept in the warden's house. Outside the prison wall was another building with a kitchen, storeroom, and an area for prisoners to meet visitors. Finally, in 1885, more money was given for improvements. A new stone wall around the prison was built. A new cell house replaced the 3 smaller buildings. This one could hold up to 500 prisoners. The cells were constructed of steel with a heavy steel lattice door. By 1918, many more improvements had been made, including the construction of a much more modern cell house built by Polygel Construction Company of St. Louis, Missouri, at the cost of $150,000. It was built entirely of steel, concrete, stone, and brick. It had 4 floors with 200 cells arranged in tiers, with 50 cells on each tier. Cells had running water, a steel bed with a cot and mattress, a wool blanket, steel folding chair, and electric lights. But the best part was the installation of the Stewart's patent jail and locking and operating device, manufactured by the Stewart's Ironworks Company of Cincinnati, Ohio. This locking device allowed an entire row of cells to be controlled by levers instead of keys. This way, prisoners could not tamper with the locks on their cell. The levers were located at the end of a row of cells out of the prisoner's reach. Using the various levers, officers could open or close one cell door at a time, or all the doors in the row. This was state-of-the-art technology at the time, and used in other prisons such as Rikers Island, Leavenworth, Sing Sing, and my favorite historic prison, Alcatraz. As of right now, only 2 prisons in the nation still have this patented locking device in use, Alcatraz and the Utah State Prison in Draper. Just like all the prisoners, this locking device went with them to the new prison in Draper. It's still functioning and used today. I'll talk more about this device later on. In the 1920s, all of the buildings were updated with electrical lights. Yeah, that's right, some were still lit by candles and oil lamps up to this point, and connected to the city sewer system. This made life for inmates and employees much more comfortable. But still, talk of a new prison began in the late 1920s. The current site was now surrounded by houses and businesses, as it was no longer outside the city limits. In addition, the number of inmates kept growing, leading to overcrowding, and of course, there was the ongoing issue of upkeep and repairs. In 1937, a new 1,000-acre site was located about 20 miles south of Salt Lake City in what is now Draper. Ashton and Evans architects were selected to design the new prison, and construction began in the late 40s. In March of 1951, even though it was still under construction, the new prison opened. 570 inmates were transferred from Sugar House to Draper, and the original Utah Territorial Prison was closed and destined for demolition. In 1855, when the prison was opened, 9 convicts were committed. In 1856, 9 more were added. 1 in 1857, none in 1858, and 6 in 1859. During this same time period, 12 were pardoned, 1 released due to wrongful conviction, 3 escaped, and 9 served out their entire sentence. It was the job of the warden to keep a journal of all the happenings in the penitentiary. In 1861, James Little was elected to serve as warden. He kept very few records, but by the end of his term, there were no prisoners left in custody. Now, this was not a good thing because, except for 1 prisoner who was pardoned, all escaped from the prison. Now, this was probably a combination of his ineffectiveness and the dilapidated state of the prison. Not a good combination if you want to keep prisoners in the prison. From 1896 to 1950, over 200 inmates escaped from the prison. So let's talk about a couple of these escapes. Now, warning, not all of these ended well. To set up this first story, keep in mind that guards locked up prisoners at night and didn't check in on them until the next morning. In 1863, 2 prisoners, Angelos and Dives, dug a hole from their cell to the inner courtyard. Once in the inner courtyard, they made rope out of their blankets, threw it over the outer wall, and climbed over. Now, you may think that they had found their freedom and were off in the night, never to be seen or heard from again. Not quite. Instead, they broke into the county courthouse and stole some money, then returned back to the prison with their goods and were in their beds in time for the next morning's checks. They did this a few more times to go into the city and steal more money to stockpile in anticipation of their final escape. Just when they were ready for that to happen, they were found out and put in irons and watched over by guards day and night. This made Dives pretty angry, and he set out to escape again for good. Here is an account made by Warden Rockwood about Dives' escape in March of 1864. Quote, "It was our custom at the close of the day for the 2 guards to conduct the convicts to their cells and lock them up for the night. One of the guards was armed and stood at the door while the other guard conducted them in. Dives came to the guard at the door and said he had forgotten to empty his night vessel. The guard let him pass out with the vessel, when as soon as he was outside, he turned and slammed the door, locking both guards on the inside. It was customary after locking up the prisoners for one of the guards to retire outside the inner court and the other remain in the inner court for night guards. This was well known to Dives, and he went to the door and impersonated the guard by knocking for the turnkey to let him out. It was dark. The turnkey could not discern that it was any other person but the guard. Opened the door. Dives snatched the key, locked the door, and made off, taking the key with him. Thus, he made good on his escape." End quote. A reward for his capture, dead or alive, went out, and after a few weeks he was seen in Salt Lake City. The police found Dives and shot and killed him while he was trying to evade them. His body was returned to Warden Rockwood the next day. Then there was the famous stretcher escape from 1921. 5 prisoners somehow smuggled guns into the prison, which they used to overpower the guards. They made the guards trade clothes with them and locked the guards in their cell. With the guard uniforms on, they went towards the hospital with one of their own on a stretcher. The tower guard thought they were taking a sick inmate to the prison hospital and let them through, but got suspect a bit later when all 5 prisoners threw a ladder over the wall and tried to scale it. The escaping prisoners were fired upon, but all disappeared. A few days later, 3 of them were found hiding in the prison hospital basement, but 2 had made a successful escape. Only one of the escapees was ever apprehended. The other disappeared. Disappearing from the prison was a rarity. Most escapees were returned or died during an apprehension. But Harry Brewer, on the other hand, did just that. He was in prison for murder and was set to be executed. However, his sentence was commuted to life. He was a model prisoner, attended school, followed the rules, and eventually he was allowed to work outside the walls on the farm. When Harry heard that a new warden was to be appointed, he asked to be brought back in from the farm, stating, quote, "There seems to be a new warden coming in, and I have no way of knowing if I will like him. I'll wait and see who he is. If I don't like this new warden, I'll leave from inside the prison compound." End quote. Apparently, Harry didn't like the new warden, because in June of 1921, the morning count was 1 man short. Harry was missing. The mystery of how he made his way to the outside was never solved, and Harry was never heard from again. In 1882, the Edmunds Act was sponsored by Senator George F. Edmunds of Vermont and signed into law by President Chester A. Arthur. This act made polygamy a felony and cohabitation a misdemeanor, removing the need to prove actual marriages had happened. More than 1,300 men and a few women were jailed throughout Arizona, Michigan, South Dakota, Idaho, and Utah due to this act. Now, this had a huge impact on the prison because most of the men ended up housed at the prison. Raids were made throughout the Utah Territory, and the U.S. government even employed spies to report on those guilty of polygamy. Many men were forced into hiding, but many others ended up with pretty hefty prison sentences, sometimes up to 8 years, and large fines. In fact, during the 1880s, around 1,000 men found themselves imprisoned at the penitentiary. Some women were even sent to the prison for failure to testify against their husbands. One could avoid a sentence by renouncing polygamy, dividing up their property, and promising to only have one wife and family. However, this option also came with the chance of being socially ostracized. Rutger Clausen was the first LDS church leader to be sentenced for polygamy. He was sentenced to 4 years and fined $800. All the men who were in prison for polygamy were made to abide by all the prison rules. This included shaving their beards and wearing striped clothing. Now let's talk a bit about their time in prison. They were placed in cells 5 feet wide, 7 feet high, and 7 feet long. There were no lights, only candles. No bathroom facilities except for a bedpan, By day, they could walk the prison yard or participate in other activities. They had to bathe once every 2 weeks and wash up before meals. Speaking of meals, breakfast usually consisted of black coffee, boiled beef, gravy, and bread. Boiled beef and soup were served for lunch, and for dinner there was mush and tea. Religious services were allowed on Sunday, and the men formed a choir and often spent hours singing hymns. On September 26, 1890, Wilford Woodruff, president of the LDS Church, issued a press release called the Manifesto, which read, quote, "I publicly declare that my advice to the Latter-day Saints is to refrain from contracting any marriage forbidden by the law of the land," end quote. The manifesto was approved at the Church General Conference in October of that same year. Something else to keep in mind with the timing of this manifesto was that leaders wanted to make Utah a state, and in order to do so, they had to renounce polygamy as a practice. So, coincidence in the timing? You decide. In doing my research for this part of the story, I came across a list of men who spent time in the prison for polygamy. And I was extremely surprised to find my great-great-grandfather, who was sentenced to 1 year in prison and no fine for polygamy. You learn something new about your family all the time. Over the years, wardens came up with ideas to raise money for the prison and to keep the prisoners occupied. A farm was established in 1896, and prisoners worked the land. This made the prison somewhat self-sufficient, and they even sold some of the produce to the community as a way to bring in income. Warden Dow had prisoners manufacture clothing, shoes, socks, and mattresses to sell to the public. This brought in over $4,000 during the first year. But eventually there was a law passed that made making money off prison labor illegal. Warden Nebeker started a cannery, molasses mill, shoe repair shop, and a soap factory. All but the cannery failed. In the 40s, Warden Harris allowed inmates to work in the kitchen, bakery, and license plate factory. He also encouraged education and vocational training. A big jump from the early days of hard labor for prisoners. Since most prisoners would be released back into society, all these methods of rehabilitation were important, and most wardens made this a priority during their tenure. Check out my Instagram and Facebook pages at Demolish Salt Lake Podcast for some really cool historic photos of the prison. Also, follow me on Twitter at DemolishedSLPod. And if you like the podcast, please subscribe and leave a review. I will be back in 2 weeks with part 2 of the story of the Utah Territorial Penitentiary. I'm going to be talking about some famous prisoners, executions. I'm going to share some stories from the community about the prison. And of course, we'll talk about the closing and the demolition of the buildings. I hope you'll join me. See you then.